All right, why don't we get started? So welcome everyone to the second day of the conference. This is a panel on the economics of refugees. My name is Selfreliance. I'll be chairing this session. And we have 4 papers, and I think we're going to aim for something like 18 to 20 minutes for the presenters. And then 5 to 8 minutes for discussants, and then the residual for Q&A. So, there's some flexibility around that timing. We'll kind of, see how it goes, and I'll try to check in and make sure we're staying on track. So our first paper will be presented by Claire McPherson, Humanitarian versus Development Aid for Refugees, Evidence from a Regression Discontinuity Design. So Claire, do you want to go ahead and share your screen and get started?
Great, thank you. Let me know if you can't hear me at any point, and let me try and share the presentation now.
The audio sounds good. All right, take it away.
Great. So thank you very much for the introduction, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm delighted to be starting this first session of the day with our paper entitled Humanitarian versus Development Aid for Refugees, Evidence from a Regression Discontinuity Design. This paper was co-authored with Olivier Sterck from the University of Oxford, and I think he's in the audience, so he might jump in to answer any questions with me later on. The broad question we address in our paper is, what's the best way to assist refugees? As many of you will know, the number of refugees has been on the rise globally. Most refugees are hosted in low and middle income countries and usually in neighbouring countries. While globally the majority of refugees now live in cities, the trend is different in Africa, where most refugees live in camps and are usually stuck in protracted situations for many years. For years, the main model of refugee assistance has been a humanitarian model of care and maintenance, and this model assumes that refugee crises are temporary, implying that the role of humanitarian organizations is basically limited to protecting and feeding refugees until they can return to their countries of origin. One key element of this model is the provision of monthly in-kind food rations to give refugees enough calories to survive through the temporary crisis. Most actors working with refugees now recognize that the humanitarian approach is actually deceptive. Crises are not temporary, and care and maintenance is expensive, unsustainable, and profoundly unsatisfactory for refugees. In 2016, the UN General Assembly adopted the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, which recognized that when refugees can access education and labor markets, they can become self-reliant and contribute to the development of the local economies in which they're residing. The promotion of self-reliance is becoming the new paradigm. Humanitarian aid spending has been redirected to encourage the development of refugee economies via things like investments in education and the promotion of cash transfers to develop local markets, support income-generating activities, and so on. A few host countries are currently implementing large-scale policy experiments to promote refugee self-reliance and try these things out and consider sustainable development for both refugees and the host populations. For example, in 2016, Jordan agreed to grant 200,000 work permits to Syrian refugees in exchange for concessional financing and relaxed rules of origin on exports. Also in 2016, Ethiopia announced a similar plan, aiming to provide 30,000 work permits to refugees. Broadly speaking, our research aims to assess whether the self-reliance approach to refugee assistance is having an impact. And in practice, we'll assess the impact of a third policy experiment, which is currently taking place in northern Kenya. So let me tell you a little bit about Kakuma refugee camp. Kenya has adopted an encampment policy, which requires refugees to reside in camps and restricts their freedom of movement and right to work. So as a result, the bulk of refugees who arrive in Kenya before May 2016 have had to settle in 2 massive refugee camps created in the early 1990s. One of these 2 camps, named Kakuma, is situated near the border with Uganda and South Sudan. It accommodates nearly 150,000 refugees who mainly originate from South Sudan and Somalia. At the time of our fieldwork in August 2017, the Kakuma camp was an archetype of the humanitarian approach to refugee assistance. The average household in Kakuma had spent 7 years in the camp, and refugees there were mostly surviving thanks pretty much only to monthly food rations. Kakuma is located in an arid area. It's got limited access to markets, to water, and to other resources, and employment and business opportunities are scarce. Only 24% of adults in the camp are working for an income, and usually this is actually for humanitarian organizations themselves. In May 2016, a refugee site called the Calbay settlement was opened just 3.5 kilometers away from the old Kakuma camp. The Calbay settlement offers a radically different approach to refugee assistance, with the aim of fostering the self-reliance of refugees and the host communities by providing them with better livelihood opportunities. It hosts slightly less than 37,500 refugees. Oh, apologies, gone too far. Most of them are from South Sudan, and in practice, the Calbay settlement shares many of the challenges that limit economic opportunities in the neighbouring Kakuma camp. The settlement suffers from its remoteness, arid climate, and lack of water and infrastructure, same as Kakuma, and as well as that, the Kenyan restrictions to refugees' rights to move and work also apply in Calbay. But it is different from Kakuma Camp because it promotes a series of programs which foster economic development, self-reliance, and integration of the refugees. Two programs were particularly notable at the time of our survey. Firstly, in-kind food rations had been almost entirely replaced by a system of mobile money transfers, which aimed at boosting local economies. And second, small-scale agriculture was more widely promoted in Calbay as a way of supplementing and diversifying refugee diets. So let me move on to talk about our identification. In our paper, we use a fuzzy regression discontinuity design to assess the impact of the self-reliance approach promoted in Calbay as compared to Kakuma. We exploit a rule which was used by UNHCR, which assigned newly arriving refugees between the Kakuma camp and the Calbay settlement by the date at which they arrived at reception. Before the 13th of May 2016, as you can see on the left of this chart, 98% of the newly arrived households went to live in Kakuma and benefited from the old approach to assistance. Whereas on the right-hand side there, 93% of the households who arrived between the 14th of May 2016 and the 21st of June 2017 went to live in the Calbay settlement. And then just at the end, after the 22nd of June, the Calbay settlement was considered full, and newly arriving refugees were once again settled in Kakuma. We use a first-hand data set from a household survey of about 2,000 South Sudanese refugees who registered after February 2015. Our main outcome variable include 4 measures related to nutrition, including a measure of dietary diversity, of calorie intake, of food expenditures, and of food insecurity. We also consider a measure of non-food expenditure, an asset index, a measure of subjective well-being, and a measure of perception of independence from aid or dependence on aid. We use 2 approaches to estimate the local average treatment effect at the cutoff date. That is the average treatment effect for refugees who arrived slightly before or slightly after the 14th of May 2016. Firstly, we use a global parametric approach in which all the observation in the sample are considered. And then secondly, a local non-parametric approach, which proceeds in 2 steps. Firstly, the selection of an optimal bandwidth of days around the cutoff date. And second, the estimation of a local linear regression of observations falling within that bandwidth. But both approaches give broadly similar results. So let me show you a few different figures which illustrate our results. Firstly, As you can see from the differences around the black line in the middle, which is the cutoff date that I was mentioning, we find strong positive effects on nutrition outcomes. Refugees on the right-hand side there are living in Calbay and benefiting from the self-reliance approach have much more diverse diets. They also consume more calories. They spend more money on food. They're less food insecure. But by contrast, we find no significant effect on non-food spending and also no significant effect on assets. So in fact, recent arrivals barely have any assets at all when they arrive in Kenya, and they spend very little on non-food items. But we do find some evidence of a positive effect on subjective well-being and some evidence of a positive effect on the perception of independence from aid. That is, how much refugees think that they are reliant on aid to sustain them. So in sum, the self-reliance approach does seem to have positive effects on nutrition and on perceptions of independence from aid at least, but it doesn't have any effect on asset accumulation and on non-food spending. The most challenging, but also perhaps the most interesting part of our paper is the exploration of the channels of impact. What explains what we call the Calibay effect? We first explore whether the Calibay effect could be driven by selection bias, i.e. by systematic differences between our treatment group and comparison group before they arrived in Kenya. And I'll focus on 3 tests to understand whether this is the case. First question is whether refugees themselves were able to self-select into either Kakuma or Calbay. The evidence from a McCreary test suggests that refugees weren't able to manipulate the allocation rule between the 2 sites, as we observe no discontinuity in the density of arrivals either before and after the cutoff date, which we think implies that refugees were not able to essentially choose their date of arrival in order to be assigned to one camp or the other. Instead, we find strong evidence that refugee flows are largely driven by violence against civilians in South Sudan. So the correlation between the frequency of arrivals in a given month and the 2-month flag of violence against civilians in South Sudan is as high as 0.69. In other words, refugee selection into Kakuma or Calbay was not a choice. It was mostly determined by violence in South Sudan, which in turn affected when they arrived in Kenya. The second robustness check tests for the presence of discontinuities in predetermined variables, which are not expected to have been affected by the treatment. Reassuringly, we find no evidence of jumps in predetermined variables like gender, age, marital status, or region of origin dummies. And as further evidence of the robustness of our design, the adjusted R-squared of regressions with and without these controls are not very different, suggesting that the predetermined control variables are relatively weak predictors of the outcome variables. Controlling for predetermined covariates does not significantly change the estimated effects. Thirdly, we also show that our main conclusions are robust to the selection of bandwidth around the cutoff date, i.e. the number of days, observations from the number of days that we include in our regressions around that cutoff date of the 14th of May. Overall, our results seem to be quite robust, especially for the outcomes related to nutrition, although less so related to the non-food spending and asset indicators. So if it's not selection bias, what could explain the Calbay effect? In the paper, we review 8 categories of explanations, so from differential access to employment, agriculture, banking or education, to differences in prices and in food assistance modalities. As we unfortunately don't have enough time to go over everything today, I'll focus here on the channels that seem to matter the most. To be a mediator, a variable should satisfy 2 conditions. First, it should be affected by the treatment and hence be discontinuous at the same cutoff date. And second, it should capture part of the Calibay effect, i.e. the mediator should be statistically significant when included in regressions as a control variable, and it should induce a change in the estimate of the discontinuity towards zero. So first, looking at income generating activities and employment, these are central to self-reliance programming. We find weak evidence of a positive effect of the Calbay model on the proportion of refugees who have an income generating activity. This effect is, however, low and it's statistically insignificant. In fact, employment is dramatically low in both Calbay and Kakuma, as only 7% of South Sudanese recent arrivals work for an income. On the other hand, on the right-hand side there, the agriculture dummy is clearly discontinuous at the cutoff. 71% of households who arrived less than a month after the cutoff date had a kitchen garden at the time of our survey, whereas this percentage is only a third for those who arrived less than a month before the cutoff date, which confirms that the wider promotion of agriculture in Calbay is one of the key differences between Kakuma and Calbay. When we add the agriculture dummy to the list of controls, we find that the agriculture dummy is positively correlated with dietary diversity and with food security. And we find that the addition of this control variable substantially reduces the estimate of the discontinuity that these two outcomes have at the cutoff date. Put differently, involvement in agriculture is clearly discontinuous at the cutoff date, and this discontinuity seems to match the discontinuity in dietary diversity and food insecurity. So agriculture promotion explains part, but not all, of the Calbay effect. Whereas by contrast, we don't find any evidence that the Calbay effect is driven by differences in education or health, access to finance, or access to public goods. So briefly then, we also tested whether the Calbay effect could be due to different market conditions, and in particular to lower prices in Calbay. At the time of our survey, markets in Calbay were relatively new and much less developed than markets in the oldest part of Kakuma camp. So the Calbay settlement is also less densely populated than Kakuma, and the different modalities of food assistance are likely, we thought, to influence prices, which implies that the law of one price need not always hold between Kakuma and Calbay. Using data on food expenditures, we find that prices are actually similar between the two sites, and if anything, they're slightly higher in Calbay rather than lower. Therefore, the difference in prices can't really explain the Calbay effect. The last channel to explore relates to food assistance. Food assistance is supposed to be of equal value between Kakuma and Calbay. At the time of our survey, in September 2017, refugees living in Calbay were receiving all food assistance through a cash transfer program called Bambashakula. Every month, refugees in Calbay received about $14 equivalent per person on a SIM card. And those of you who attended the presentation by Antonia Delius and Olivier Sterk yesterday may remember that Bambashakula is restricted in two ways. The e-money can only be spent on food or food items and only at shops which are licensed by WFP. Whereas the aid model in Kakuma is very different, or was very different at the time of our survey. Refugees were receiving more than 70% of their food ration in kind, and a small part of it through Bambashakula, the e-money transfers. The different observations suggest that a substantial part of the Calbay effect is due to the greater importance of the cash transfers in Calbay. Certainly, this channel is challenging to explore in our context because there's very little variation in the modalities of food assistance within the individual sites. Essentially, everyone in Kakuma gets the same rations, and essentially everyone in Calbay gets the same cash transfer. So compared to other mediators, we can't simply add one more control variable in regressions to assess whether this food assistance difference mediates the effect or the outcomes between the two sites. But the fact that we find positive effects on nutrition but null effects on assets and non-food spending is consistent with the fact that Bambashakula transfers can only be spent on food items. The positive effects we do find on dietary diversity, subjective well-being, and perception of independence also makes sense theoretically. Refugees in Calbay can directly and independently buy the food that they prefer, including fruits and vegetables, meat, fish, dairy, and other fresh things. Whereas diets in Kakuma are constrained by the content of the monthly food baskets, which is set by WFP. In Kakuma, the in-kind rations usually consist of about 13 kilos of a mix of cereals, pulses, and cooking oil only, and fresh vegetables, fruits, and animal products are absent from the food basket. The effect of cash transfers on dietary diversity is therefore quite logically positive. Refugees receiving cash transfers feel more satisfied and more independent from aid, as they're entitled to buy the food that they like. So to conclude, our research exploited a regression discontinuity design to explore the relative effects of the two approaches to refugee assistance. The humanitarian approach is focused on care and maintenance, while the new development approach aims to foster refugee self-reliance by strengthening refugee economies. Our evidence from Kakuma and Calbay suggests that the development approach yields better outcomes in terms of nutrition and subjective well-being and perceptions of independence. But we also find that refugees living in Calbay are far from self-reliant. The levels of food security, employment, and asset holdings are extremely low, and the labour and retail markets are heavily dependent on money from international organisations and NGOs. So there's still a long way to go before the settlement could be labelled as self-reliant. I'd like to hand back over to the chair and open the floor up to any questions, and looking forward to hearing from you.
Okay, thanks, Claire. So we have about 10 minutes for discussant and Q&A. So the discussant is Semi Tumen.
Hello. Can you hear me? Okay, so let me turn off my video and share my slides. All right. Okay. Thank you very much for the very nice presentation. It's a great pleasure for me to discuss this paper. So let me summarize first the paper. So the paper uses a fuzzy regression discontinuity design for the purpose of estimating the impact of alternative approaches to refugee aid services on refugees' outcomes. So this is a very important policy discussion recently, especially involving international organizations. So there are two competing approaches, humanitarian versus development approach. The paper formally tests the effectiveness of one versus the other. So the population of interest is the South Sudanese people, refugees in Kenya, although there are also refugees from other nationalities in Kenya living in the same camps. The focus is on South Sudanese refugees. Well, the reason is that they constitute the great majority of refugees in Kenya, and the quasi-experiment used in the paper is that the refugees are settled into two different camps based on a sharp cutoff date around May 13th, 14th of 2016. So they are randomly based on the sharp cutoff date, settled into Kakuma and Calbay camps. And Calbay camp represents the development approach, while the Kakuma camp represents the humanitarian approach. So the household survey data is used in the analysis, and data collection is performed approximately 1 year after the Calbay settlement is established. So the main findings is that the development approach has positive effects on dietary diversity, calorie intake, food security, than those arriving just before. Arriving just before means that the refugees are in a humanitarian setting rather than a development setting. There's no impact on assets and non-food spending. So they find that the Calbay refugees are more likely to be involved in agriculture, while there is no effect on other income generating activities. So this suggests that the main channel may be this agricultural activity channel. And there also exists some suggestive evidence that refugees living in Calbay feel happier. So in terms of subjective well-being, there is also a positive impact of the development approach. So my comments, I find the paper very interesting and very policy relevant. It is also very well written. So my main, I don't want to comment on the mechanics of RDD, etc. So my main concern is on whether the findings are, so these first three comments are related to the same issue. So whether the findings are directly attributable to the differences in the aid approach or other unrelated differences between Kakuma and Calbay settlements. Well, such as more qualified staff, so this is a newer camp, higher quality services in Calbay, other factors such as location, access to resources, etc. So that's my main concern. A related note is that, the institutional setting, I believe, it should be more concretely defined. So what are the exact differences between the services provided in the two camps? So naturally, there are differences between camps, but well, all kind of activities are also implemented by NGOs, local governments, and many other international organizations in the camps. I know the settings in the camps in Turkey, for example, for Syrian refugees. So it is not very easy to, isolate camps between them and implement very different policies. So you should be very clear on what is the formal setting in the two camps. So in the current version, it is a bit uncertain. So in other words, you should formally define what self-reliance means in terms of the differences between Kakuma and Calbay. And again, a related comment. So the development approach is expected to yield outcomes in the longer term, right? So by definition, so it aims to touch human capital and other sort of a capacity building approach. So I believe that the time frame is a bit short to assess the full impact of such an approach. So that's another way of approaching my first point. So is there any other sort of differences between the camps generating these differences in outcomes, or is it the differences in approach? So that's my major comment. I also have some minor comments. You said that, well, there are differences in exposure to violence between episodes. So based on my own reading, I saw that in the Calbay camp, the residents are exposed to a higher volume of violence. I don't know. I mean, you may want to explore the potential impact of exposure to violence. Are there any incumbent or pre-existing South Sudanese refugees in the Kakuma camp? So any role of mixed ethnic composition in Kakuma versus the Calbay camps? Are there any differences in turnover rates across camps? So these are mostly questions and minor comments. So, well, you mentioned in paper that, well, only very little relocations between camps are allowed in specific circumstances, but how about the turnover, right? Entry and exit, not necessarily between Kakuma and Calbay, but in Kakuma, Calbay toward other regions, other camps, etc. So any direct dissatisfaction from being in Kakuma versus Calbay. So based on your definition, Calbay is good. Of course, I'm finishing. So Calbay is good and Kakuma is bad. So is there any direct effect of these differences? And also, finally, what is the rationale for the choice of the cutoff date? So is it a response to something, some event by UNHCR, or is it totally random? Okay, thank you very much. This is the end of my comments.
Thank you, Sami. So we have a couple of minutes for questions from the audience. If anyone wants to chime in, please feel free to do so. I see one question in the chat that I'm happy to. And Martin, why don't you just unmute yourself and go for it?
Thank you so much for the talk. I wanted to ask about the role of the timing. So if the refugees compare on both camps have been living in a camp for the same time, and whether the outcomes one looks at a lot in the months following the arrival to a camp. Thank you.
Claire, do you want to go ahead and answer?
Yeah, great. Happy to take that. So by definition, the refugees who were assigned to Kakuma camp before the cutoff date have been living in Kakuma a little bit longer than those who arrived to Calbay after the cutoff date. But we did our survey approximately, almost 2 years after that cutoff date. So some will have been there for a few months longer, but overall it evens out. And we did look at whether the outcomes sort of changed by over time, as well as whether they're in one camp or the other. And it does seem to be the difference between the two sites that makes a difference. But certainly refugees' outcomes do change a lot compared to when they first arrive. Obviously, everything is very new, and they may be much less established, know where markets are, or have any kind of access to an employment opportunity. So it does change, but since everyone we interviewed had arrived or had been there for around 2 years, they were all quite established by that point. And shall I answer some of the discussants' questions, or do we need to move on?
I think we actually need to move on, but feel free to continue the conversation with Claire over chat. And thanks very much, Claire and Simi, for great presentations.
Thank you.
So coming up next, we have Sarah Schneider-Straczynski from PSE. If you want to share your screen, Sarah.
Hi. Yes. Okay.
All right, all yours, 18 to 20 minutes.
Okay, so thank you. So today I'm going to present you a paper that I have with Cyprien Battu, entitled Arrival Guest or Defined Hosts, the Economic Impact of Refugee Hosting, and in which we look at the effect of opening refugee centers in France. So the cost for welcoming asylum seekers and refugees is often used in the backlash against immigration discourse. So here you can see a tweet of the far-right leader Marine Le Pen, who says, "We welcomed a considerable number of migrants, and now those without a house are in the street because there are no more space in emergency housing center." So she's invoking this cost in crowding out against immigration. And actually, when we think of refugee hosting, there are several potential costs. First, there is the accommodation cost per se. So it accounts for 0.3% of the French state budget in 2018. And then you can also have potential costs from what we will call a refugee rivalry. That is the fact that refugees may compete with natives over the sharing of scarce resources, such as public goods or jobs. And finally, you can also have costs from what we will call the native defiance, the fact that natives change their behavior when they enter in contact with refugees. And for instance, if you think that opening a refugee center can entail segregation pattern, this segregation pattern could also have some economic cost. So to address these costs, the French government implements a dispersal policy in order to spread the burden of hosting refugees in small-scale centers that account for 0.3% of the population on average. And so in that paper, we will ask ourselves three main questions. The main one being, what is the impact of receiving small inflows of refugees on the local population? And we will be looking at a change in population because we think it's a good indicator of a local population's response to the opening of a refugee center. So as Thierry Bousset in his paper in 19 56, people can vote with their feet. And so we could see two types of phenomenon. First, we could see a native flight, that is that the native population would leave the municipality in which a refugee center opened, or we could also see a native avoidance phenomena, that would be that natives avoid moving into municipalities that opened a refugee centers. And this change of population could be due to the refugee rivalry, so actual threats on the labor market, decreased living environment because of a rise in criminality because of the refugees, or it could also be due to the native defiance, so a reaction of natives not motivated by the rivalry, but by other factors, for instance, their prejudice over refugees. And finally, what we will answer and look at is the economic consequence of this population change. So in terms of the firm activities, the municipality revenues, and we will try to estimate in a model the aggregate cost to society of this change in population. So in our paper, what we do is that we look at 98 refugee housing centers opening in France between 2004 and 2012, and we perform an event study analysis over 4 years using the spatial allocation and the timing of the refugee housing center openings. And our main outcome that we will look at is the population, because, as I said, it can reveal shifts in native preferences. And in order to circumvent the lack of precise and regular data on population, we will use two proxies. First, the resident employed population, which has the great advantage to be monthly data, and then the number of households in order to confirm our results for a non-working population. So what I will show you is that following the opening of a refugee housing center in the municipality, there is a decrease of up to 2% of the population, and that this decrease in population is actually due to a native avoidance phenomena, that is that prospective newcomers come less to hosting municipalities compared to non-hosting municipalities. And we will show that we find no supportive evidence of a labor supply shock or of a surge in criminality that could explain such change, such native avoidance. And after, I will show you that we find that there is indeed, because of this native avoidance phenomena, a decrease in local economic activity and an aggregate cost to the society. So the data that I will be using are data from the French Ministry of the Interior on all French centers for refugees, asylum seekers, and beneficiary of the subsidiary protection. So it's quite extensive because it provides us with information on the type of center, the name of the operator that is running the center, the date of opening, the capacity, and the exact address of the center. And in order to implement this dispersal policy, the French government runs a centralized opening process where it launches regional and regular project calls to create the refugee housing centers, to which national housing landlords and national local NGO will apply to open and run a center. And importantly, municipalities or local political power have no say in the process. And so in that context, what we have to be careful about are two things. First, how do the government select the winning projects in which location? And second, how do the NGOs or the national housing landlords choose which project in which location to present to the proposal? So on the first side, the government selects winning project using a selection grid that relies on three main criteria: the architectural aspect, the quality of the project and the future operator, the funding modalities of the center, and there were no criteria relating to the location of the housing center. So it was really a top-down process in which the municipalities didn't have to get notified or to accept, such that in the end, they had no information and no leverage over the opening process. For the NGOs, so from exchange we had with actors of the sector, we know that in the end, what they try to do is to get as many points as possible on this selection grid, and that the location was never a big concern and was mainly driven by the availability of a building already owned by the national housing landlord, the NGOs, because often they work for different kind of publics over the French territory, or the availability of a building that could be rentable for 15 years. So for the data on the population, we use payroll tax data to create a monthly municipal panel with the number of employed people living in the town and working in the town. And we complement this population data with income tax data to have information on the number of households in the municipality. We also have economic data to measure the municipal economic activity with the sum value added, the value of sales, the number of firms, and information on local taxes collection from the French territory. So what we do is an event-by-event analysis, where we compare the outcome trend 2 years before and after the opening of a center between hosting municipalities and non-hosting municipalities, but within the same commuting zone. And so we perform this event-by-event analysis over 49 months with event time fixed effect, municipality fixed effect. We cluster the standard errors at the municipality level. And in the end, the estimated effect measures the average deviation of hosting municipalities relative to their commuting zone trends after the opening. So without specification, there are two identification hypotheses. The first one is that the opening in one municipality should not affect control municipality. So in order to address the threat of spillovers, we will always present an alternative specification where the control group is composed of a matched sample of municipalities, but outside the commuting zone. And in addition, in our preferred estimation, we will control for time varying effects that also vary according to the distance to the hosting municipality, so in the spirit of Clark in 2017. The second identification hypothesis is the parallel trend assumption that says that outcome trends in controlled municipality should be a good estimate of what would have happened without the opening in the hosting municipality. And so here we present you the raw data on the resident employed population before and after the refugee center opening. And you can see that hosting municipality do not differs in their pre-trend from other municipalities from the commuting zone, and that they start diverging really after the opening of the refugee center. So for the results, our result is that the population is decreasing. So after the opening of a refugee housing center, so in our preferred specification, which is the event analysis accounting for spillovers, you see that there is a 2% decrease in the population after the opening of a refugee center, and we confirm that we find the same result with the number of fiscal households. We also present you the dynamic of the effect, and you can see that before the opening of the refugee housing centers, hosting and non-hosting municipalities do not differ, but that they start really diverging after the opening of the refugee center, with a decrease in the population for hosting municipalities. So we know that the population decreased, but then it could be either due to a native flight, so an increase in outflows because people would be leaving the municipality because of the opening of the refugee center, or it could be due to a native avoidance phenomenon, so a decrease in inflows, that is that people would come less to hosting municipalities compared to non-hosting municipalities. And here in that table, you can see that what we find is that we do not find evidence of an increase in outflows, so we don't have a native flight, but what we have is really a native avoidance effect with a decrease in outflow of around 2.8%. So why people would come less to hosting municipalities? So it could be because there is an actual refugee rivalry, a competition, an increased competition on the labor market, or that there are more crime in these municipalities after the opening of the refugee center. However, we look at it and we find no significant effect of the refugee center opening on the labor market, and we find no significant effect on the criminality. And that's why what we think is that prospective newcomers value negatively the presence of a refugee center, maybe because of their prejudice over the population. Because, for instance, when you look at the retiree population, who is a non-working population, usually with no kids in school, they are equally affected by the phenomenon. And also we find that richer households are more affected, which also makes sense because they would have more relocation choices. And so this native avoidance, in any case, is likely to have an economic cost because the avoiders are potential consumers and taxpayers. And indeed, we do find that there is some economic consequences of this native avoidance. The activity of firm is decreasing, so the number of firms decreases by around 3%, and the value of sales decreases by 5%, and as well the revenues of the municipalities decrease as the taxes that they collect decreases by 3%. And we also use a spatial general equilibrium model in order to show that there is an aggregate cost to the society with a reduction in welfare growth because of this native avoidance resulting from the opening of the refugee housing center. And so to conclude, so what we find is that the opening of a refugee housing center decreased local population by around 2% because of native avoidance and not because of a native flight. We find that there is a local and aggregate economic impact of the center opening. However, that this effect is not driven by the refugee rivalry, but rather by natives themselves. And these findings have some policy take-up. First, dispersal policy seems to address rather well the refugee rivalry, given that we find little evidence of a competition effect, no impact on the number of crime. And the second policy take-up could be that there is an economic incentive to address natives' prejudice over refugee hosting, because by addressing the root cause of the segregation, we could reduce the economic impact of refugee hosting. And as I'm seeing that I have a bit more time, I will conclude a second time on the contribution to the literature. So we contribute to the literature on the impact of refugee inflows on residential preferences, because we show that segregation can happen without going over a tipping point, so even for really small scale centers, and that this can happen through native avoidance. We also contribute to the literature on the impact of immigration on the local population preferences by showing that natives who are in contact with humanitarian migrants do not leave refugee hosting municipality, where it deters those who are less in contact with them from moving into hosting municipalities. And also we contribute to this literature by studying the local economic consequences of these shifts in preferences. We also complement the literature on the refugee rivalry by showing that part of the economic impact of the refugee arrival may be driven by natives themselves, and also by showing that the native labor supply may not be fixed in the short term when we perform this kind of analysis. And finally, we contribute to the literature on the local level dynamics of population and on the reasons for the uneven development of places by emphasizing the role of amenity shock as a source of divergence between localities, and by proposing a methodology to compute the aggregate welfare cost of the redistribution of population. And I'm done.
Okay. Thanks very much. So the discussant is Andreas Steinmeier, and take 5 to 7 minutes, so we have a little time for Q&A. Andreas, do you want to unmute and get started?
Good. Okay. Hi. Can you see my slides?
Yeah, you might want to make them full screen if you can.
Okay, yes. Okay. All right. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to discuss this paper. I very much enjoyed reading it. Let me start with a brief summary of the paper. So the paper tries to identify the local economic effects of opening asylum seeker centers. Local economic effects expressed as the number of population in these municipalities, but also in other measures of economic activities. They do this in the context of France. So they look at asylum seeker centers, relatively small scale centers that were opened between 2004 and 2012. So that was a period before the big increase in 2015. Their empirical strategy is to compare the outcomes of municipalities that opened refugee centers with the outcomes from municipalities that did not. And to do so, as a comparison, they use municipalities from the same local labor market, so to ensure that they face similar economic shocks. The identification argument, the key argument they bring forward is that this opening process is very centralized and so leaves municipalities little discretion over the actual opening of these centers. And the findings are quite striking. They find very large negative effects on population and on economic activity. So at some point in the paper, they have this estimate that one additional refugee place in a center reduces the local population by 3 to 6 people. So that's really a strikingly large effect. And they also kind of find very large effect on other measures, like that opening a refugee center decreases the number of firms in that municipality by 3% and decreases sales by these firms by 5%. And they argue that these results are driven by reduction in native inflow into these hosting municipalities. So let me start with what I like about the paper, and there is really a lot to like about the paper. First, it answers a highly policy relevant question. It's a question where the results are ex ante not really clear. So you could think that additional demand that occurs due to opening of these refugee centers might also provide a boost to the local economy. But then, as the paper finally shows, there could also be these negative reactions by natives, and that may cause like native flight and native avoidance, which might have negative local economic effect. I think they study an interesting setting and use interesting variation. One thing that's really worth highlighting is also their creative and careful use of a lot of different available data. So they really put together a very impressive data set from many different sources to look at various aspects of this question. And then they do not stop short by just identifying a reduced form effect, but they do this additional step of conducting a welfare analysis. And finally, I'd like to say it is a very competently executed and well-written paper. Just to highlight two things. like in the appendix, they work out the identification problem using DAX, and Sarah briefly mentioned is the spillover effects, which play an important role in their identification. They really invest a lot of addressing these problems properly. So what is my takeaway after reading this paper is really, it was like, wow, these effects are large, right? How can we explain such large effects? And also they occur pretty fast. So they look at a time window, the authors of 2 years, and these effects emerge over the course of these 2 years. And the argument is these results are not driven by labor market competition. They are not driven by an increase in crime. So, but what seems to be really driving these effects is that people in other municipalities get a more negative view of these hosting municipalities and then stop moving there. So this, what Sarah calls native avoidance. So I was asking myself, how is that compatible with other evidence that we have or that you also present? One thing is you mentioned in the paper, and you also have a graph for that, that opening of centers receives very little attention in the news, especially in this period before 2015. So I found that quite surprising, especially if it had such stark consequences, which you would expect that people in these municipalities really felt. And then I also tried to kind of square my head, and I didn't really fully come to an answer, how your very strong negative effects on the local economy are compatible with other findings we have, like the effect of exposure to refugees on attitudes towards refugees. Some papers find that some negative effects on attitudes, some others even find that attitudes improve, but overall these effects seem to be relatively modest. So it's not clear what is really driving, whether this is, how this is compatible, this stark effect. So I think in terms of selection problems, so the opening process has several steps, and I think you very much focus on the third step. And so there is this regional call, then NGOs and national housing landlords apply, and then the authorities select projects. And your argument for exogeneity of the treatment really hinges on the third point, that there is this authorities, central authorities that select projects based on for logistic reasons. But the problem and the question that I think should be answered in the paper and really would improve the credibility of your results is, why do NGOs and national housing landlords in some municipalities apply in the first place? I mean, you can easily come up with stories where that could be related to local economic shocks. So I think it would be very helpful if you provide more information on the applicants who applies and also those that, I have a slide here.
Yeah, Andreas, sorry to interrupt. I want to leave some time for questions.
Yeah. Okay, so that's an issue, and one thing, the last thing that concerns it are possible pre-trends. So I think that's also something that you should look into. Okay, and then have some smaller issues. Thanks.
Thanks, Andreas. So we have a couple of questions. So Francesco Fasani has a question, so he can go first, and then Eugenie Rose Fontep.
Okay, so thank you. So really nice presentation, really interesting paper. So very quickly, so one question was basically following from Andreas. I was wondering whether you can think of comparing applicants with applicants, and rather than municipality who applied and municipality who didn't apply, but are geographically close to each other. And it seems to me that the applicants, the municipality who applied, have a score, so you eventually could compare municipalities which are close in score, and some of them were assigned a center or not. And the other thing is about the way you phrase your finding is about reduction in population, but what you actually find is a reduction in the growth of population, so growth less than in affected municipalities, and this is about rephrasing what you found exactly. So this is driven by inflows, if I understand correctly, which reminds me of some work by Joan Moras on internal migration and and shocks. But importantly is if it's inflows, so these are people who were planning to move to those municipalities and decide not to do that, they may well decide to move somewhere nearby. And this may inflate your, given you're comparing municipality nearby, this may exaggerate and inflate your findings, which goes back to Andrea's point about the size of that. And let's stop here. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's take the two more questions and then give you a minute to respond. So Eugenie Rose, do you want to chime in? Jeannie? Okay, not sure. So maybe Luigi, why don't you go?
Yeah. Hi, can you?
Yeah, all good.
So it was just a follow-up on Andrea's point. I think would be you showed some evidence of parallel trend. What would be kind of strengthening the paper would be to show some descriptives of municipalities that apply versus municipalities that do not apply for these centers. I mean, we care about parallel trend, but we would also care about, you know, at the levels, you know, of characteristics sort of. And then you could also try to see, you have these, I guess, 89 centers would be, you could just pick those 89 municipalities and throw all the others away and just use try and use just the time variation and see whether the results hold when doing that. Thanks.
Thanks. Sarah, do you want to take 1 minute and respond quickly to these comments?
Okay, so I'll try to answer. So I completely agree with Andrea's comment on why do they apply in the first place. So I quickly talked about it in the paper, but I think in the written version, we have to give more evidence on this. Regarding the possible pre-trends, indeed, we plan to extend the graph in order to see better what is happening before. Unfortunately for we use those who didn't succeed in the proposal at all, because unfortunately, right? Completely agree. Yes, it's a decrease in we are talking about growth in population. Yes, for the fact that maybe those who don't come go nearby, that's exactly why we have this second specification where we use a match sample of municipalities and that all of them are outside the commuting zone, so they are not nearby municipalities. For the descriptive, yes, they are in the paper. I skipped it for the presentation in order to keep it short. And also for the difference in level, because we do the matching, we also have the specification in for identification. So I think I covered.
Okay. Great. Thanks so much, Sarah, and Andreas, for a great discussion. So let's switch over now to Volantis, who will present next. Take it away, share your screen, and you have up to 20 minutes, but feel free to finish early and leave more time for Q&A.
Just a question. I have problem with the mute.
Sorry?
I have a problem.
It looks like you're unmuted.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. Let me thank you so much for the invitation, and let me try to present you my paper, which is joint project with Risa Megalokonomou from the University of Queensland. So
can you share your screen?
Sorry, wait a minute, just give me a second. Again, sorry about this. Seems okay. Is it okay now?
Looks good. Yep. If you want to go full screen.
That's it. Okay, yeah. Sorry about this. So the effect of, I will talk to you about the effect of exposure of refugees on crime activity, and specifically I will talk about the evidence of Greek islands. This is an early stage project, so any comment is welcome. It's a paper joined with Risa Megaloekonomou from the University of Queensland. So I think most of you that you are doing migration, people that they don't know migration, they are aware that the political instability in Middle East led to the hugest refugees crisis that happened lately. So this immigration, large immigration flow led a very big debate in Europe about the effects of exposure of refugees in economic and society. There are a lot of papers that they show lately that even the most extremely right parties start to rise because of these reasons. So one of the debates that exists, it's about accusation about if this higher level of immigration leads to higher crime rates. To be honest with you, the scientific evidence, it's very mixed results. There is a literature that shows that they find significant effects in immigrant influx of crime rates. There is a literature that says that there is not impact of the refugees on crime. There is literature that shows that the natives increase the crime rates because of the presence of not only of refugees, but immigrants because of labor competition. So the key question that we have, actually we have two research questions. Do refugees commit more crimes in the destination countries? And what are the crimes that are more likely to be committed? To be honest with you, we benefit from exogenous variation in the number of foreign-born population across Greek islands, which started to increase the number of foreign-born population in 2015. Just to make you a remark to understand, before the 2015, almost the foreign-born population in the Greek islands was less than 1%. After the refugees crisis arrived to be more than 8%. In 2015, all the neighbor countries around Greece closed the borders, and as a result, most of the refugees sent to local camps, and the government built not only hostel, but mostly to Greek islands, specifically 10 Greek islands. I would like to make you a remark here. We have in Greece, there are in Greece 107 Greek islands. Only 10 receive it because they are very close to the border of the Turkish coast. And at the same time, happened the agreement between the European Union and Turkey that until to accomplish their asylum process, they cannot leave from these islands. Otherwise, if they leave, they are not able to be returned back to Turkey in case that the asylum procedure is rejected. Frankly speaking, the process took quite a while specifically because there were not European Union, Greek government, they were not ready to process very quickly the asylum process, and took quite a while, almost more than 2 years to process the asylum. So during that period, they stay in these 10 Greek islands. So what we are doing, we are constructing hand-collected data on annual crime activity for all the Greek inhabitants islands over the 4 years, using newspaper reports, and also we use as robustness official police data on crime rates. We collect data for crime for 2013 to 2016. We include violent crimes like personal robberies, with knife attacks, rapes. We have also protests. We have property crimes like property robberies, common thief or breaking a thief, and also drug-related crimes. And to investigate the causal relationship between the refugees and the different types of crime, we use two methodologies. The first one is deep in deep, because as I said to you that we have 10 islands that from the sample that they took the treatment, and other 97 islands that they don't take the treatment. The good point for this facilitate of our identification strategy is that the fact that these islands are very close to the borders, to the Turkey borders, and at the same time also the Greek islands belong mostly to the same district, so they have specific similar characteristics across them. And the second one, which is we use an instrumental variable approach, which is we try to solve potential measurement error, omitted bias, also self-selection of migrants. So our findings based on the tooth methodologies are very similar. So there is an increase in crime of the base of 3 to 5% in the islands that they receive those refugees, and they host the asylum seekers. So we also find that this increase is mostly attributed to the crimes committed from the foreign-born population. On the other hand, we don't find any change on the crimes committed by natives. Also, we find that when we split to see the different crimes, we find that there is not an increase in the drug-related crimes, while there is an increase in the number of property crimes, personal robberies, and rape. To see that our results, whether it's robust or not, we use two placebo exercises. The first one, we use a group of islands that are comparable and to the refugees hosting, and they didn't experience the refugees crisis. And we find that there is not any change in the criminal activity after 2015. Also, we have another placebo test, which shows that the pre-2015 trends on exposed and unexposed islands are identical. First, the contribution of the paper we consider is that first is we provide very rare causal evidence of the effects of exposure of refugees on the crime rates in a European country. The second one, we are able to study the effects of the refugees on different types of crimes rather on aggregated crimes. And we use two databases to show the robustness of our results, which is the one, the newspaper reports that we use, and another, the official statistics, police statistics that the estimate shows that very the same. This study draws on a new panel, which is cover all the habitable Greek islands. As I said already, it's 107 islands. So what we do, we have collected all the crime incident records for all the local newspapers on all of these islands from the period 2013 to 2016. So each crime incident report in the newspaper usually provides information about the ethnicity of the individual, who charges about the crime, the specific crime committed, and when exactly the incident takes place. For instance, to make you an example, one of the incidents that as recorded from the newspapers is that we have several in the paper, which show 3 people were arrested yesterday in Chios, which is it's a Greek island. 3 Algerians aged from age 26, 23, 26, and 27. They charged with theft and aggregation corruption. According to the investigation, the unfortunate people broke into cafeteria in Chios and removed various alcoholic beverages and instant drinks. And they also caused material damage. On the same vein, we have collected from this period from 2013 to 2016. So some of you will ask me, okay, why you try to spend time to collect so huge amount of data comparing to have the police data? The first one is that we wanted to see whether they are robustness. The second one is that all the newspapers give us the possibility to they report all the crimes that incidents independent whether the suspect is arrested or not. In contrast, all the official police data that exist, they report only the arrests. So might consider that the police data, they might be considered like a kind of bias comparing to the newspapers. And at the same time, what we like to claim is that since both of them are robustness, we could quantify that the real evidence is between these two estimates of the police and newspapers. The second one is that because in the case of very small islands, like take an example which is Agathonisi Island, which is very, very small but received a lot of refugees, which arrived to the point that at a certain point the population of refugees were higher than the population of almost close from the population of inhabitants. The official police data are not disaggregated at island level. It's more at more aggregate level, which makes more difficulty not to include for our sample. Data on refugees arrivals per island are collected from the United Nations. We construct geographic data in terms of distance because we use the distance interacted with the time as an instrument for our specification. So for the instrumental variables approach, and we construct from the Google Maps the distance between the closest point that from detected borders. Population data are collected from the National Greek Statistical Centers. About the identification strategy, to investigate this exogenous variation of the number of refugees, we have two empirical complementary strategies. The first one, as I explained already, is about a definitive approach. We consider that the 10 islands are the treated group. The rest 97 islands we consider to be the control group. Then we alternately with our specification, and we consider like a noise regression, including the crime rates as independent variable, and the share of refugees in each island as independent variable, and then we use an instrumental variable approach, which we use the distance interacted with the time as an instrument. For robustness of our results, we use two placebos. The first one is pretrends. So we see that on exposed and unexposed islands, they remain the same, the crime rates. And also we try to change, and we have a kind of placebo treatment, and we consider that the islands comparable to the refugees hosting, we try to use them as treatment group, and we see that these islands, they don't have any activity that the crime rate increases. So the presence of asylum seekers, what are our results is that we show that the presence of the asylum seekers in the Greek islands stimulates considerably increase in the total crime rate. We find a positive and significant effect in the post-treatment interaction damage for all the different forms of crime, including vehicles, property, robberies, attacks, rapes, and at the same time also other protests, but we don't find any effect in the crime. The high quality of the data give us the possibility to distinguish the crime based on people that they are foreign-born population or natives. And the results shows that the results of the crime, increase in the crime, is based from the fact from the foreign-born population. The results in IV regressions are the same, identical with the ones that we were doing with DFID. And at the same time, for reasons to make a particular example, 1% point increase of the share of refugees increased by 3.4%, 4.8% included with the instrumental variable specification. All the results that I mentioned to you, they are robustness not only in the placebo regressions, but also when we rerun again all the regressions with different specifications and the methodologies using the police data. To conclude, it's very important to try to investigate the research question about whether forced migration on crime exists effect or not. This paper exploits an exogenous increase in the foreign-born population that happened in some Greek islands. We find that these Greek islands exposed to the higher share of refugees leading to an increase of the crime activity from certain types of crime, except the drug-related crimes. We also find that these results are committed specific for the foreign-born population, but not the natives, and conducting different placebo or alternating in the database, we find that the results remain the same. As a future results, we are planning, it's important to investigate the channels, the mechanisms through these effects, and at the same time, we consider that these results should be a kind of alert, not only for the Greek, but also for the European authorities to take measures to help, for instance, specific these Greek islands in terms maybe speeding the asylum procedure, maybe moving these people to the continental Greece, providing to these people different solutions, better life and to solve this kind of problems.
Okay. Thanks very much, Volantis. Our discussant is Toando from the World Bank. It's all yours.
Yes, hi. If Chris, you could unshare your screen so that I can share mine.
Yeah, just give me a second because it seems that I have an issue and I don't know why.
That's good.
Oh, it's okay now?
Yes.
Yep.
So thank you for this interesting talk, and it really makes it feel very personal in the sense that I spent a month in Greece 3 years ago, surveying the asylum seekers, but we didn't get to go to the islands for safety reasons, to be precise, as the reasons whether official or not. So just let me summarize quickly the paper. I think it fits in this literature that looks at the causal impact of refugees on crime, and that's a literature that is getting more and more dense over the years, and it adds a very rich source of data, and I think that's one good point with this paper. You address the issue of endogenous placement with an IV that I believe is quite convincing, and the results is an increase in property crime and some force of violent crime. So let me try to organize the discussion around 3 points. One will be on the more academic, if you want, econometric standpoint. The second is what do we think? How do we want to think about the external validity of the study, and then maybe some suggestion about framing that will hint at the last words you put in your conclusion. So in terms of internal validity, I think one of the big hurdles you will face through the publication process will be one of reporting bias, in a sense that we can expect the media, we can expect the police, we can expect the population to be more aware and reporting instances of crime with a higher accuracy when there's this initial presumption that crime is going to be due to the inflow of refugees or asylum seekers. So this issue is not being addressed by the IV, obviously, but that's something that I think you will have to have some detailed discussions about in order to bring a convincing case that what you have is not differences in measurement rather than some underlying things going on. I think the more interesting part of my discussion will be about the external validity. So just to be very clear, and I think you should be you should clarify the semantics in the paper, is that refugees and asylum seekers are very different from a legal standpoint. So, and the characteristics of the Greek islands is people who have been left limbo, legal economic limbo, for a very, very long time. So we're really talking about people who are not given the opportunity to work, they're not given any visibility on their future status within the EU, and are left in a protracted situation with the minimum assistance from Greek or EU authorities. So I think it's important to think of, are we talking about the impact of refugees on crime, that it was covered in the previous literature? Are we talking about asylum seekers who are not refugees? And I think that's a distinction if you want to be able to engage with institutions like UNHCR, is a distinction that is important, because their point and the policy discussions is really about how to speed up the asylum seeking process, how to create better living conditions, because those issues are first order policy issues for them. So this is I think on the semantics. And the second point is we are talking about a massive inflow of asylum seekers in the Greek islands. We're talking about close to 10% of the native population being displaced in islands like Lesbos. So are we really talking about, is this result where the size is very different, where we can think of the composition of refugees or asylum seekers also different because of its size, is something that can be generalized to wider debate on the net effect of refugees on the local economy. So that's, I think, the issues for you to think about. And then the implication of that is how do you want to frame your paper? Is it a paper on refugees and crime? And this is part of this long literature that has shown positive effects, negative effects, and so on and so forth. Or do you want to engage in a more immediate policy issues about the issue of refugees, asylum seeker hosting policies? That's something you've alluded at the end of your talk. But I think the big policy questions currently have, not the World Bank, but more the UNHCR, is how do we get the processing of the asylum seekers applications to be faster? How do we improve the conditions so that there is better visibility? And I think that's, whether we are talking about refugee admission policies or we are talking about hosting policies, I think it's two different directions that will appeal to different type of audience that you will need to think about. And that's all I have to say, but that was a very good paper to discuss. Thank you.
Thanks, Toan. So let me open it up and see if we can collect a couple more questions and then let Volantis respond. Are there any questions from the audience? Feel free to just unmute and ask.
Yeah. No, yeah, sorry for the interruption. I got a question about, maybe you said at the beginning, whether I'm trying to understand whether this population of refugees is kind of like, are they staying in the island or just passing by? And because I'm thinking about, there's work by Konstantino Matakos and Dominican Garden on the effect of all this population passing by on the Greek islands on voting behavior. And if this is the case, then basically you're basically underestimating a lot the size of the actual population passing by, and therefore exaggerating the impact on crime.
Any other questions? Okay, Volantis, why don't you take a couple minutes, respond to Toan and Francesco?
Actually, the information that I have when I went, because my origins in coming from one of these islands, so I have been visited several times the authorities to ask them. Most of the people that they are coming, almost the 100% of the people that they are coming here, they apply for asylum. So what is the point is that almost all the people after close to after the first 3 months, as I am aware, of 2015, these people stay and remain to the Greek islands. So the Greek government did not allow them to move to the continental Greece once the border are closed. So all of them, they remain to the Greek islands. The only that I can confirm to say is that more people were coming, none was leaving from the Greek islands, to answer to Francesco, and thanks for the nice question. In the paper, we try to explain about the reporting bias in terms of about the newspapers and about the police. And as I claimed during the presentation, I don't want to claim that we found the best way to report, to say that we found the true estimate, but we can say that we have, because both of the police and both of the newspaper reports give us the possibility, if we like to say that we can have like a kind of confidence interval to say that between these two estimates, this should be the real estimate. I don't want to say that I don't want to claim that our database is the best one in terms of collecting from newspapers, but it counts a lot the weight and in many details the fact that there happened some incidents that probably it was not a possibility to these people to be arrested. As related about the refugees and asylum seekers, I like to, we will take into account this comment. And about the size and the composition, we have a specification which is we take into account, as I said, we will use a simple OLS estimation, which will use the share of refugees, which is take into account the size of the refugees in each island. And I think it's a potential way to measure the size. About the composition, it's a good idea that we need to take into account to improve the paper. We could divide them in terms of ethnicity. We have to think about it. For non-linearity, if he could be a little bit more specific what he is meaning, for me, we can have like an individual chat later on. It would be great to us to see how we can improve on this side. I don't have anything else to add. Thanks all of you for your comments, and I appreciate the time of the discussion to read our paper.
Great. Thanks, Valentis, Tuan, for great presentations. So let's move to the final paper, which will be presented by Michael Vlasopoulos from Southampton. So if you want to share your screen, all yours.
Hello. Just give me 1 second, please.
Yeah, of course. Looks good.
Good. On the screen. Okay. Shall I go?
Please.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. This is I'm going to present a paper with the title "Mixing in Early Childhood Evidence from Syrian Refugees in Turkey," and this is joint work with a number of co-authors. We jointly, I think, span 4 continents. So Vincent Boucher from Laval University, Canada, Semi Tumen, who was a discussant earlier in this session, Jackie Waba at Southampton, and Yves Zenou at Monash in Australia. Now, let me start by giving a bit of context for the study. We're looking at Syrian refugees in Turkey, and it's now been almost a decade since the beginning of the Syrian conflict in 2011, which, as you know, huge. And what's characteristic of this wave of Syrian refugees is that they have been, for the most part, hosted. So they were displaced in neighboring countries, Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. And as of now, it seems there's that the displacement is becoming now protracted, and there's no indication that there will be a massive return movement or systematic repatriation of the refugees. So it seems like they're going to be staying at least for the short term or medium term. And so this makes the issue of the social integration of the Syrian refugees in the host countries a major policy issue. In particular, looking at the case of Turkey, who has been hosting up to 4 million refugees, Syrian refugees, and among whom about up to 1 million are school-age children. The integration of this demographic into the education system is a crucial policy issue, and it's crucial because not just for the academic prospects of the refugee children, but more broadly because of the importance of education for their social and emotional development. So whether the refugee children are successfully integrated into the school system is important for their future labor market prospects, and for more widely for their social integration into the Turkey, in the host country. And in addition, the integration or lack of integration of the Syrian refugees can also affect, in turn, the attitudes of the native children's attitudes towards the refugees, which will matter for the status of or the state of social cohesion in the host country. So what does this paper do? So what we basic question that we ask against this background in which Turkey is moving in the direction of trying to integrate the Syrian refugee children into the education system. The question we ask is: does mixing refugee children with host children in early childhood educational settings, will this enhance the integration process, and how will it impact the social cohesion in this setting? And to this question, what we're doing is to embed a randomized field experiment into the design of a summer camp early childhood program that took place in Turkey in the summer of 2019. And more specifically, the nature of our intervention was to randomly allocate participant children who participated into this summer camp program, to randomly allocate them into groups of variant ethnic composition. So we formed groups with high, medium, and low refugee concentration, and that then allows us to estimate the causal impact that refugee concentration has on outcomes of both Syrian and Turkish children in this context. So in terms of outcomes and preview of findings, we're going to look at three types of outcomes. So starting with a measure of pro-social behavior that we're going to elicit in the field through a variant of dictator game type of game adapted to the local conditions and to the fact that we are dealing with preschool 5-year-old children. And we're also going to look at the tendency for the children to form interethnic friendships. That's going to be another outcome we're going to be interested in. And also we're going to have measures of the language skills acquisition development during the course of the summer camp. And this is going to be a relevant outcome for the Syrian children. And just to preview the findings, we find that for Turkish children, contact with the Syrian children leads them to behave less prosocially. So we find tendencies or behavior of in-group favoritism, displaying the children displaying in-group favoritism. And in the dimension of friendship, we find that contact with non-coethnic children does not affect the formation of interethnic friendships. So the higher the share of Syrian children in their group doesn't increase the likelihood that a Turkish kid becomes a friend with a Syrian kid. Now, with regard to the Syrian children, we find slightly different. We find different results. We find that contact matters for the incidence of interethnic friendships. So more the Syrian kids interact with or are in groups and interact thereby with Turkish kids, are more likely to form friendship relationships with them. And we also don't find any evidence of in-group favoritism. So we don't find that Syrian children discriminate in their giving in the dictator game on the basis of the ethnicity. And finally, in terms of language skills, we find we find across the board essentially improvement in language skills that doesn't seem to be a function of the refugee concentration in one's group. So in terms of placing our paper in the literature, our paper connects to a literature that investigates the so-called contact theory or contact hypothesis, which is the hypothesis that intergroup contact improves relationships between groups under certain circumstances. And I'm not going to have time to go through the details of all the papers in this growing literature within economics, but in a nutshell, we think that our contribution and what differentiates us from the existing how contact plays out in early childhood, which to the best of our knowledge hasn't been investigated, and also we're looking at contact between refugee, and in particular looking at contact between refugee and native kids. And in that regard, our paper then also connects with a literature on the formation of preferences, which argues and shows that early childhood is important for social preference development. So let me get on to give you some more details about the context and the field experiment. And as I mentioned earlier, Turkey has received a large number of Syrian refugees, and a large share of those are school-aged children. And one interesting and relevant statistic here is that of the school-aged children, about actually this is a typo. It's school-age children that should be ages from 5 to 17. About 64% of them are enrolled in academic year 2019-20, and this is a major policy concern in Turkey. The relatively low attachment to school, and this is particularly true for kids of high school age. And then just to mention that, because it's relevant to mention a bit the background in terms of the educational services offered to refugees, which has gone through various phases as the crisis has unfolded, starting with in the first phase where these services were provided to refugee children in either in camps or in special centers that were set up. And the crucial point here was that the initial approach was to keep those the provision of education to refugees segregated from that of the Turkish kids. But that approach has shifted. Starting in 2016, the system shifted towards the direction of integrating Syrian children into the Turkish public education system, and in particular, it's has been realized and recognized that the integration should focus on in younger ages, and this is where the program that we investigate comes in. So the program we investigate is part of this effort of integrating the refugee kids at earlier ages. So the program we look at is a 9-week program over the summer of 2019, from July to August, and it's implemented in 26 provinces and 500 schools. About 37,000 students are enrolled into the program, half of which are refugees. The curriculum is prepared by the Ministry of Education of Turkey with input from UNICEF, and around 2,000 teachers were assigned or signed up voluntarily to be part of this program.
Michael, sorry to interrupt. Just a heads up, you have about 3 minutes left.
Okay, yeah. The goals of the program are to provide early childhood education to the disadvantaged kids and to improve social and educational integration, as well as to prepare Turkish children and their parents for the multicultural educational environment that they would embark on once they start school. Field experiment that we was implemented in Gaziantep, which is a city of about 2 million in the southeast part of the country, so it's close to the border with Syria, and our study involves picking 46 schools out of the full sample that have about 50% refugee concentration, and then randomly selecting 11 of those to implement our experiment. Say a few things about the sample and then quick summary of the results. So we have 11 schools, and students are within those schools are randomly assigned to 36 groups of sizes varying from 10 to 24, and the balance in the groups varies between low, medium, and high refugee concentration, and we're not allowing the kids to switch groups and schools for the duration of the study. So we have overall about 600 students, half split between Turkish and Syrian kids. We collect data twice, at the beginning and the end of the program. As I'm running out of time, I think I'll just skip going through the details of the analysis and just recap what we find. I think I've given a flavor of what we do. What we find in terms of the results is in the dimension of prosocial behavior, we find the Turkish children to be more likely to give when the recipient is a co-ethnic kid, so they exhibit in-group favoritism, and we don't see. Whereas for the Syrian kids, we don't see this type of in-group favoritism. If anything, we see weak evidence of favoring the out-group. In terms of friendship, indirect friendships, we'd see results suggesting of exposure to leading Syrian kids to increase the likelihood of forming friendships with Turkish kids, whereas we don't see that type of effect for Turkish kids. So our kind of takeaway message from this setting or from this study is that contact alone does not seem to guarantee improve intergroup outcomes between refugees and natives in educational settings, and this is kind of a bit inconsistent or not in line with some of the previous evidence on this question.
Great, thanks so much. Let's turn over now to, if you could unshare your screen, we'll turn over now to Luigi Manale, the discussant from Carlos Tercero.
Okay, let me just figure out how to unshare, stop sharing. Okay.
Okay, let me know if you can see my screen now.
All good.
Oh, good. Perfect. Okay, thanks a lot for having me discussing this paper. Very interesting, and sorry also for having one few co-author on the slide. I think in the version of the paper that I've received, one co-author was still not part of the team. So I think this is a very interesting paper. I mean, we usually say that when we discuss paper, but this is really the case because it's especially the topic is particularly relevant. And I think there is a big gap in the literature that looks at the economic assimilation of refugees, which usually focuses on adults. And while we know that intervention at the very early stage might have an important impact, and on top of that, we know very little about what fosters assimilation of children in school age. So in this sense, this paper is very welcome. And the paper kind of speaks to two literature, both have to do with kind of testing the contact theory. But one is more related to the kind of does it on the race, ethnicity kind of dimension. So we have all those papers that are usually exploit some randomized trial and look at mixing blacks and whites or different ethnicity. And then the other kind of literature is the one on native immigrant contact. Usually this literature exploits larger scale national experiment to see whether contact to direct contact to immigrants kind of changes the preferences of natives. So what is special about the paper I'm discussing is that the participants in the experiment are very young age. So this is, I think, unique. And although they kind of use this randomized controlled trial methodology, probably the paper kind of talks more directly to the native immigrant contact. This is to say that in this paper, there are both dimensions. There is both the ethnic dimension, Turkish versus Syrian, but also the migrant status dimension, natives versus refugee. I think this is nice, but also adds a layer of complication to how we should think about the context and the results. And I think this is also related to another comment I have. In the introduction, there are many different literature that are cited, up to 5, I think. This is absolutely fine because the paper speaks to many literature, but I think probably in the future you want to focus a little bit more in which specific gap of the literature your paper really is thinking about fitting best. Now, probably the most important comment of this slide, which I'm going to kind of elaborate further in the next one, is that I found the paper having many interesting results. However, I found at time a little hard to navigate through them because exactly there are many different results and sometimes they kind of go in different directions. So you have the Syrians who react in a way, but then Turkish kids react in an opposite way, and then these results might differ depending on the outcome you look at. I don't think they are inconsistent. I think it's interesting. However, maybe thinking about adding a sort of theoretical framework that guides the empirical analysis and the interpretation of the results could help navigating through these results. And then I don't have a specific kind of suggestion on which way to go, but I've tried to think, for example, would be there is a clear way to separate the two treatments that I think are going on. One is the assignment, the other one is the contact. And one could look a little bit further into the data by splitting these two treatments. Now I'm going to show you what I mean by that. So I'm going to skip the recap because you already explained well what the experiment is about. Let me just underline that there are 37 classrooms, and then you randomize the share of Syrians in each class. Students cannot switch class, so that is good. The econometric is done well. You have school fixed effect, standard errors are clustered at the right level. And then the outcome is measured both at the beginning, so after the assignment, but when kids did not have time yet to interact, and then at the end of the 2 months. Now, why I talk about two different treatments? Because I think there is one treatment, which I call assignment, is that kids are assigned to classes with different shares of kids from other ethnic groups, okay? And this treatment is continuous. There is a support that goes from 20 to 80%. We miss the 0, so we don't really have a full control group, okay? But apart from that, this is, I think, is the first sort of treatment, and then you have collect the first wave of data. And already here it's interesting to see how kids respond to having been assigned, so to be in a class with many, say, kids from another group. And then there is a second treatment, which is the contact. So kids are exposed for 2 months to different shares of kids of the other ethnicity. Okay, so everybody is exposed to this treatment, this contact treatment. And although this treatment, of course, varies in the intensity, because there are different shares of kids you're exposed to, but not in the duration. They're all exposed for a period of 2 months. And after these 2 months, you collect the second wave of data. Now, just to exemplify what I'm saying, I just take the descriptive statistics. I'm sorry, the people in the audience are seeing this descriptive for the first time, but in the first column, you have basically the results from the first kind of survey, then the second survey, and then the difference. And then what I meant to show is that if you compare, for example, the stickers, so if you compare within the same column, you're gonna have the effect of the assignment treatment. Okay, so individuals who are assigned to different groups, you already see at the beginning that it doesn't seem that kids who are assigned to classes with a high share of Syrians have a different attitude in terms of the dictator game. If you look at the row, you're going to see the effect of the contact treatment. And then what you do in the regression, we didn't have time to discuss them that much, but you kind of estimate a relative effect in between high and low shared classroom. So what I just want to say is that I think it will be interesting to look deeper into what happens in these two treatments differentially, in order to understand, for example, whether the results really stem from Turkish, for example, students being discriminating, or because there is something else going on. I have a number of other comments, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip them, and I'm going to just email you these comments here and leave the floor to further questions or comments.
Thanks so much, Luigi. That was great. Are there other questions from the audience? Feel free to chime in. Okay, if not, why don't Michael, why don't you take a couple minutes to respond to Luigi if you'd like to?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Luigi, for taking the time to read the paper and for the thoughtful comments. Yes, please do send them along. Just let me quickly say that I completely, agree with you on the issue of the literature and how exactly, to kind of place the paper. I made an attempt today to convince you where the contribution lies with regards to the contact theory type of literature, which of course is vast, so we need to narrow it down. With regards to your other point about having a theoretical framework, this is you're spot on. This is exactly what we're working on. So we're working on developing a theoretical model and structurally estimating it in order to be able to do some policy analysis on questions to do, for instance, with what is the optimal level of mixing in terms of welfare. And yeah, this is the kind of the direction that we're taking. Thank you very much for the comments.
All right. Thanks, everyone. 4 great papers, great discussions. I learned a lot. Thanks very much. So I see Chalar, or I saw him a moment ago. I'm not sure if he wanted to say anything, but we're going to take a half-hour break, and then the next sessions will be in a different room. So
yeah. I don't have anything to add, Sam. Thank you to all the presenters, discussants, and especially to you. So we'll see everybody in half an hour. Go get your coffees or afternoon drinks, whatever it is, and we'll see you in half an hour.
All right.
Thank you,
Bye,
guys.
everyone. Thanks.